Hi everyone, we're back with chapter 4 of our book. And so finally we've come to the trial. And it's January 7th, 1985. And Jennifer was allowed to sit in the courtroom. So remember we talked about that in chapter 3. Usually witnesses, victims, they aren't allowed in today's world to sit in the courtroom. But the DA in this case wanted the jury to always see the victim, and so she is allowed. So she's up against a lot. Jim, the prosecutor, tells her at the bottom of page 60, he told me the trial would be an enormous emotional burden. Not only would I have to tell everyone in the court exactly what happened to me in explicit detail, but also the defense would bring up anything it could to make me look unstable and promiscuous. So remember, we do a lot of victim blaming in our society even today. Well, you must have been wearing something, or you drank something, or you acted a certain way. There must have been something that you did to bring this on to you, when that's never the case. Even when she was dressing for trial that day, her mom even gave her a disapproving look on what she had worn. She wasn't allowed to go out in the hallways by herself in case she ran into Ronald Cotton's family. The defense lawyer did come over and gave his condolences to her about what happened, and she saw on the other side of the aisle Ronald Cotton's family, and there was tons of them. And she's like, my brothers didn't even show up for this. And he had all this family there for him. And so she knew at this trial she had to perform. She was on trial herself. She had to come across as believable, otherwise they wouldn't find him guilty. And so she ends up taking the stands. It's nerve-wracking for her to do that. And there are very specific, detailed questions about oral sex and things like that that she has to answer. And she can see her dad's reaction in the crowd. And when they take a break, he just ends up holding her hand because, it's a lot for him to take. And then they go back with her on the stand on page 64. And she says, yes, that she can identify the man in the room who raped her. And she raises her finger and points at him. She says, wishing I had had a gun instead and could get a clear shot at him so I'd never have to see that face again. So her hatred at this point for Ronald Cotton is extreme. And then it's time for the defense to question her. And so he changes certain things up. So instead of saying her underwear, he says panties to make it sound like she was bringing this on based on what she wore. And then he had asked her about, her fears. We all have certain fears. And so her fear was waking up to someone in her room. And so he says on page 65, if you have a fear of someone standing over your bed watching you, would it not seem more appropriate for you to go to bed with some kind of nightgown on or something? Miss Thompson, he says. So again, it's that victim blaming. Well, you didn't wear the right clothes to bed. And she says, if I walk outside my bedroom stark naked, that doesn't give anybody the right to take what's not theirs. And so she was more determined now than ever, being questioned by the defense, that she didn't want to be tripped up. She wasn't going to do that. And then on page 66, we find out that Ronald Cotton's alibi had changed. Now, if it was a regular day for you, and 5 days later someone asked you all your whereabouts on some random day, would you be able to remember everything you did that day? Some people don't. In this case, Ronald Cotton thought he was at a club that night. His family's like, no, you are at home sleeping on the couch. We know that. But for Jennifer, she thought, well, your alibi is not right, so therefore you're lying. And I think she was mad that more people showed up for Ronald than for her on page 67. She says, Ronald Cotton must have had 3 times more people there than I did. And the defense in the closing argument says there's no physical evidence in this case. There isn't. But the state's case, they have the piece of rubber found in her apartment. It's consistent with the shoes found in Ronald's apartment. Not saying that they came from the same shoes. It's just consistent with those. But it could be consistent with a lot of other shoes in the world. And then there was a witness, the woman who saw him riding his bike at 4 a.m. And then the fact that his alibi, they say, was a complete lie. Well, no, he just, if you're innocent, you might not remember the right day. But they also pointed out that she was under stress when she was given the photo lineup and the physical lineup. And apparently Ronald Cotton had scars. Remember back in chapter 1, she was asking herself, it was on page 15, she was asking herself, did he have scars? Well, now we know he did, and she never identified those. So maybe if you're the victim, do you think, well, wait a minute, maybe I didn't see the right person. I didn't identify the right person. If this person has scars, and I don't remember him having scars that night. But for her, she doesn't go that way. The defense also tries to get a memory expert to come testify in court, and they deny that. And so how long does it take the jury to find him guilty? 40 minutes. That's as long as they needed. 40 minutes, and they found him guilty. And so they find him guilty, and then next comes the sentencing. And so at that point, the defense lawyer can't just go up to the judge and say, well, we're innocent, we're going to, they have to say, okay, he was just found guilty. All right, he didn't try to kill her, he put the knife out on the porch. And so at that point, the judge isn't going to listen to any kind of innocence plea, they're going to listen to only the guilty part. And so for Jennifer, she doesn't really understand how the court system works. And so in this case, she thinks, oh, well, his lawyer knows he's guilty. And that's not the case. The lawyer has to say, well, okay, if we're looking at the sentencing phase, he's been found guilty. We can't go back to saying he's innocent. We have to move on and look at the sentencing part. And this is what the judge said in the middle of page 69. That young lady will go to her grave with certain emotional scars as a result of your client's conduct. She saved herself by her wits. She may not have a scar that goes from the top of her head down to her cheekbone, but she has those emotional scars, and they'll be there every bit as long as the physical scars that, few in number though they may be, your client has. And she says she could have hugged the judge because he recognized what she went through, even though she didn't have the physical scars to it. We also find out the bottom of 69, there's a little footnote here. These are called footnotes. Sometimes they're at the bottom of that page, or you can find them in the notes section in the back of the book. But here we find, because of a court case called Croker versus Georgia, there's no death sentence for rape. So you can't be put to death for rape. And the thing that struck Jennifer and her sister was that during this entire time, he never said anything. They all thought that, he's the sinister man and he should be, turning and looking at them evilly. But he didn't do any of that. So on January 18th, 1985, Ronald Cotton was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. And so they're walking out of the courthouse, and there's this Confederate statue. Remember at the beginning of the book, right before chapter 1, there was that inscription from that said statue. It said, "Conquered, they can never be, whose spirits and whose souls are free." And so we hear here at the bottom of 70 a little bit about the history of the statue. So in that square there, Wyatt Outlaw had been hanged from a tree on February 26, 1870. He was a former enslaved person. 1870, so that's 5 years after the Civil War ended. 2 years before, so that would have been 1868, he had been appointed town commissioner. His killers were never arrested. Remember what Brian Stevenson said in the documentary True Justice about the lynchings. They never knew who did all of those. And then in 1914, the United Daughters of the Confederacy had raised money for the statue to honor the county soldiers who had served in the Confederate Army. Now, I want to talk about these Confederate statues because right now during the protest, there's a lot of them that are being graffitied and they're being pulled down during the protest because of what these Confederate statues represent. They represent the people who enslaved people in this country. And when we say enslaved, it doesn't mean that they had just a little side job where they worked in their home. It means they beat them, they brutalized them, they murdered them, they raped them. And think about that as well with this. How many generations of people are alive today because a white slave master raped his female slave? So that gives all of this even more new meaning. So up on Cobra, in this folder for chapter 4, I've got I got a video and an article, okay? The first video is the history of these Confederate statues. It's important to understand when these statues went up. They didn't go up right after the Civil War. They went up later than that. And there's a reason why for that. So watch that video. It'll give you some really good information. The other question is, where's this statue today? Is it still standing? Guess what? It still is. Here's an article where 2 men were arrested during protest right outside the statue. Okay, so that statue, unfortunately, is still up. So in the rest of chapter 4, they celebrate back at the DA's office. Jim tells her, I'm confident a dangerous rapist has been removed from the community, and we couldn't have done it without you, Jennifer. If only all witnesses were like you, you made my job very easy. So at the end of this chapter on page 72, she says, it was the happiest day I had in the past 6 months. I had done my job well, and Ronald Cotton would rot in prison. That night, I lay in bed and prayed. I prayed for Ronald Cotton to die miserably in jail, alone and afraid. But before he left this earth for hell, I asked that he know the horror of being raped. So that's where she is in her life in regards to Ronald Cotton. She wants the worst for him. So how do you think when 11 years later they have to go and tell her you identified the wrong man? So it'll be interesting to see what happens when we get to that point. Alright, so make sure that for this chapter you go watch the video about the Confederate statues as well as read that short article. If you guys have any questions about any of these chapters, please let me know. Remember, you have the annotation worksheet to turn in for this week along with the reading. Have a good week, guys, and I'll talk to you later.